The air hung heavy and still, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and something else, something metallic and sharp, like ozone. 3 men in identical, light gray pajamas stood in a line on the paved street, spaced about 5 feet apart, facing the viewer with expressions ranging from bewildered to deeply concerned. In the center, a man with thinning brown hair held a cell phone to his ear, his brow furrowed in concentration. Slightly behind a dark SUV, angled towards the viewer, stood a 4th man in a dark suit. His tie was loosened, his usually impeccable hair slightly disheveled. He wasn't facing the other men, but seemed to be watching something beyond the frame, his posture tense, one hand resting on the rear panel of the SUV. On the back window of the SUV, a large, bold message was printed, stark against the dark glass. It wasn't a typical advertisement or bumper sticker. It was a single word, stark and unsettling. Watch. The man on the phone lowered it slowly, his eyes wide. He looked at the other 2 men in pajamas, then over at the man in the suit. They said they can't find anything, he whispered, his voice hoarse. No record of the call, no alarms tripped, nothing. The man in the suit finally turned, his gaze sweeping over the 3 men in pajamas, then back towards the invisible point of his focus. His face was grim. "That's impossible," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "We all heard it. And we all saw." He trailed off, his eyes flicking to the dark SUV and the unsettling message on its window. One of the men in pajamas, a portly man with a nervous tick in his cheek, wrung his hands. But what was it? It sounded like breaking glass, but everywhere at once. The 3rd man in pajamas, younger and with a mop of unruly hair, shivered despite the mild evening air. And the static, it felt like it was inside my head. The man in the suit pushed himself off the SUV, walking slowly towards the 3 men. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning their faces. "Whatever it was," he said, his voice gaining a hard edge, "it wasn't a prank call. And the fact that no one else heard it, that's the most disturbing part." He gestured towards the surrounding suburban homes, their windows dark and silent. Everyone else is sleeping. Or pretending to. He looked back at the SUV, at the word "watch" emblazoned on the glass. "We need to figure out what's happening," he stated, his voice firm. "And we need to figure it out before whatever caused that sound decides to make itself known in another way." He met the eyes of the man who had been on the phone.
"Get dressed."
"Both of you," he said, gesturing to the other 2 men in pajamas. "We're not going back inside until we have some answers." The air seemed to grow colder, the silence of the suburban night suddenly feeling heavy with unseen possibilities. The simple act of standing on a quiet street in their pajamas had just taken a deeply unsettling turn. The man in the suit, whose name was Arthur, didn't wait for them to respond. He turned on his heel and walked towards the front of the SUV, opening the driver's side door. The interior lights flickered on, casting a dim glow on the dashboard. The man who had been on the phone, a nervous accountant named Gerald, exchanged a wide-eyed glance with the portly man, whose name was Frank. The younger man, a graphic designer named Liam, just stared at the SUV, a look of dawning horror on his face. "Get in," Arthur called from the driver's seat. His voice was curt, leaving no room for argument. Gerald fumbled with his phone, shoving it into the pocket of his pajama pants. "But where are we going?" he stammered. Arthur didn't answer. He just started the engine. The low rumble of the SUV seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet street. Frank, his face pale, nudged Gerald. He said, "Get in, Gerald. Let's go." He started walking towards the SUV, his movements stiff and hesitant. Liam, however, remained rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the back window of the SUV. "The message, it wasn't there before," he whispered, more to himself than to the others. Arthur leaned out of the open driver's side window, his eyes narrowed. "What wasn't there?" Liam finally tore his eyes away from the window and looked at Arthur. "The word. Watch. It wasn't there when you parked the car earlier." A beat of silence stretched between them, taut with unspoken dread. Arthur's jaw tightened. He looked in his rearview mirror, then back at Liam. "Are you sure, Liam?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Liam nodded, a tremor running through him. Positive. I helped you unload the groceries, remember? The window was clean. Arthur's eyes scanned the dark street, then the silent houses. The feeling of being observed intensified, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He looked back at the word on the window. It wasn't painted or stickered. It looked like it was part of the glass, embedded within it, glowing faintly with an internal light that wasn't there a moment ago. All right, Arthur said, his voice tight with a new urgency. Forget getting dressed. Just get in the car. Now. Gerald and Frank were already halfway to the SUV, their pajama-clad legs pumping awkwardly. Liam, still shaken, finally broke his trance and hurried towards the vehicle. As they climbed into the back seats, the interior of the SUV felt strangely colder than the outside air. Arthur pulled the door shut with a solid thud, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. He didn't turn on the headlights. Instead, he put the SUV in drive and slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to roll forward, away from the beige houses and the unsettling message on his own back window, into the darkness of the suburban night. The only light came from the faint glow of the dashboard and the unsettling, internal luminescence of the word, "Watch," in the rearview mirror. The SUV glided silently down the street, a dark shadow against the darker shadows of the sleeping neighborhood. Arthur kept his speed low, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror, watching the glowing word, "Watch," recede into the distance. The silence inside the vehicle was thick with unasked questions and mounting fear. "Where are we going, Arthur?" Gerald finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Arthur didn't answer immediately. He made a slow turn onto a deserted street lined with tall, dark trees. The air here felt even colder. "Somewhere we can think," he said, his voice strained. "Somewhere away from that." He glanced at the rearview mirror again, the word, "Watch," a faint, lingering ember in the receding darkness. Liam, huddled in the back seat, shivered. Do you think it's following us?" Frank let out a shaky breath. "What is it, Arthur?" Arthur pulled the SUV over to the side of the road, under the cover of the trees. He turned off the engine, plunging the interior into near-total darkness. The only light was the faint, persistent glow from the word on the back window, now a tiny speck in the distance. "I don't know," Arthur admitted, his voice rough. "But it knows we saw something. And it wants us to know it's watching." He paused, listening to the silence of the night. There was no sound but the gentle rustling of leaves in a non-existent breeze. "The sound," Gerald said, his voice trembling. "The breaking glass and the static." "It wasn't glass," Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the faint glow in the distance. "It was something breaking through." "Breaking through what?" Liam asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Arthur turned to face them, his face a pale blur in the darkness. "I don't know," he repeated, his voice lower now. "But I think we were witnesses. Unwilling witnesses to something that wasn't meant to be seen or heard." A sudden, sharp rapping sound from the rear of the SUV made them all jump. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was distinct, like a fingernail tapping on glass. Arthur froze, his hand going to the door handle. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice barely a whisper. He slowly opened his door, the interior light briefly illuminating the fear on the faces of the three men in pajamas. He stepped out of the SUV, closing the door silently behind him. The only sound was the frantic beating of their own hearts. Arthur crept around the back of the vehicle, his eyes scanning the darkness. There was nothing there. No one. He reached out and touched the back window, where the word, "Watch," had been. His fingers brushed against the glass, smooth and cold. The faint glow was gone. The word was gone. He frowned, confused. Had he imagined it? The sound? The word? Another sharp rap, this time from the front of the SUV. Arthur spun around, his eyes wide. He saw it then. Not a person. Not a thing. Reflected in the smooth, dark surface of the SUV's hood, where the headlights would normally be, was the word "Watch." But it wasn't just a word anymore. It was a gateway. Within the reflection of the word, the darkness seemed to writhe and twist. Shapes, indistinct and unsettling, began to form, like shadows made of pure night. They pulsed with a faint, unholy light, and the sound returned, a low, grating static, combined with the chilling sound of something shattering. Arthur stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at the windshield, then at the side windows. The word "watch" was now reflected in every smooth surface of the SUV, and within each reflection, the darkness was deepening, the shapes becoming clearer. They were not shapes he recognized. They were impossibilities made manifest. From inside the SUV, a collective gasp. Arthur looked back at the vehicle. The faces of Gerald, Frank, and Liam were pressed against the windows, their eyes wide with terror. And reflected in their eyes, Arthur saw it too. The same writhing darkness, the same impossible shapes, the same shattering sound. The air around the SUV grew impossibly cold. The scent of ozone intensified, sharp and metallic. The static in their minds grew louder, a deafening roar that drowned out all other sound. And then, the reflections in the SUV's surfaces didn't just show the shapes. They began to pull. Arthur felt an irresistible force tugging at him, a cold, invisible hand reaching out from the reflective surface of the hood. He tried to resist, to back away, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. Inside the SUV, Gerald screamed, a sound quickly swallowed by the static. Frank and Liam thrashed against the windows, their faces contorted in silent horror. The shapes in the reflections surged forward, solidifying, reaching out with impossible limbs made of shadow and broken light. Arthur felt himself being drawn inexorably towards the reflection on the hood, the word "watch," now a gaping maw of swirling darkness. He caught a final glimpse of the terrified faces of his friends in the windows, their pajama-clad bodies being pulled towards the reflective surfaces as well. The last thing Arthur saw, before the reflection consumed him, was not the trees, or the street, or the suburban houses. It was the chillingly clear image of his own wide-eyed face, reflected in the dark, reflective surface, and within that reflection, the word "watch" had transformed. It wasn't just a word anymore. It was an eye. A vast, unblinking eye, staring back. And as the darkness closed in, Arthur understood. They weren't just being watched. They were being taken. And the quiet suburban street, under the cover of darkness, had become the threshold to somewhere they could never return from.